Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pennsylvania edition of our state webinars exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Moving to slide 2. Before we get started, let me run through some logistics to help make this a good experience. And let me start by saying, because technology is what it is, I am speaking without access to the slides, and I have an excellent navigator and my colleague Beth Fraser, who is helping me with the slides. So that's why I'm saying slide number, whatever. But let me talk about a couple of other logistical issues. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, and we will have time for that throughout the webinar, look at the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There's an orange arrow at the top of that panel that allows the panel to shrink and reopen. In that panel, you'll see a question section. To get to that section, push on that little square, which will unlock that question panel. It'll pop it out so that you can type in a question or a comment, and please feel free to do so throughout the presentation. We are recording this webinar and will send the link to the recording to everyone who has registered. Please feel free to share this recording with anyone who is not able to make it today. So next slide. Let me now introduce myself. I am Chris Coffin. I'm AFT's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Jamie Moreau, AFT's Mid-Atlantic Regional Director. Jamie joined AFT in February, and she is based in Washington, D.C. On slide 4 now. For those of you who are not familiar with American Farmland Trust, let me do a very quick introduction. AFT is a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We started as, and remain, an agricultural land trust, but that is one small part of our work. We care not just about protecting acres, but inches as well, and we are deeply involved in developing tools to help farmers improve soil health and water quality. We also believe it is not farmland without farmers, and focus on the viability side of agriculture as well, increasingly, as land access and farm transfer and succession. Our programming is grounded in research and informs our state and federal policy development and advocacy. So let me now turn it over to Jamie.
Thanks so much, Chris. We can turn to the next slide. We are delighted to be joined today by a number of very valued partners. These include the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture, Penn State University and the University of Pennsylvania, National Young Farmers Coalition, Stroud Water Research Center, and many, many Pennsylvania land trusts and local governments. So thank you so much for joining us today. And now I'd like to introduce a very special guest, Doug Wolfgang, Farmland Preservation Bureau Director for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. Doug, we are so grateful to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Jamie and Chris, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we thought we would start by asking you your perspective about farmland loss generally. So I've got a few questions for you.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Why should Pennsylvania citizens care about farmland loss?
Yeah, certainly. So before I get into that, on behalf of Secretary Redding, the Bureau of Farmland Preservation, our 58 participating county boards, 23 participating land trust organizations, we'd like to thank American Farmland Trust for the report. It's certainly the most comprehensive land use study on loss of farmland that we've ever seen, and we greatly appreciate the effort. We hope the report will help to guide future land use decisions here in Pennsylvania and across the United States in the decade ahead. So again, thank you so much. So why should Pennsylvania citizens care about farmland loss? Well, Pennsylvania has some of the most fertile non-irrigated soils found anywhere in the nation. We're within a day's drive of a large percentage of the nation's population that will always rely upon a safe and abundant food supply, and that population is growing. Agriculture here is diverse. For example, we're first in mushrooms, we're second in organic production, we're third in direct farm sales, we're fourth in grapes, eggs, apples, we're sixth in milk production, we're seventh in chickens. In total, it's a $135.7 billion total economic impact, thousands of jobs, and nearly 20% of our state's gross domestic product attributed to agriculture and farming. Pennsylvania has historically been an agricultural leader dating back to colonial times. Farms and farming are part of our culture here, and that's evident throughout the state. Pennsylvanians have for years been concerned about the loss of farmland. Looking back at that original ballot question in November of 1987, when voters across the state approved a $100 million bond referendum to fund farmland preservation. That was repeated with Growing Greener 1 bond referendum in 1999 and Growing Greener 2 in 2005, and numerous local referendums over the years, all passing by wide margin. Pennsylvanians recognize the need to save and protect farmland. The program has always had widespread public support, and that's been to our advantage. And the issue has had awareness. So in 2020, as we look ahead, I believe COVID-19 and the threat of climate change further supports the need to continue preserving Pennsylvania's farms. There's a heightened level of awareness of food security right now and our connection with local food and how fragile the food supply chain can be. Climate change is another big issue facing us in the future. California and other parts of the country rely heavily on irrigation, whereas Pennsylvania does not. We're blessed with the right soil, climate, hydrology, that what we have as a resource is so precious. So Pennsylvania's preserved farms will feed the nation, the region, and the world in years to come. We've done a great job, and that needs to be pointed out. A glimmer of hope here, although the study, as we'll get into, Pennsylvania lost a heartbreaking 244,000 acres to housing developments from 2001 to 2016. We've also been able to permanently preserve 347,000 acres during that same time period, and that's thanks to the hard work of many people who are on this call. We need to recognize that and celebrate that, but also acknowledge that there's much more that needs to be done because that rate of conversion is not sustainable. And the AFT report, we feel, is a good starting point for these discussions.
Wonderful. So, Doug, how might this report inform the work of the department?
Yeah, so, we like to tout here in Pennsylvania that we lead the nation in farmland preservation with over 5,700 farms and 600,000 acres preserved. We're over a $1.6 billion investment. And we'll add to these totals later in the week when the state board meets to approve 49 additional farms. The report points to the staggering losses of farmland, and it's a stark reminder that there's so much more work to be done. Across Pennsylvania, the last time we polled, there are 1,400 eligible farms on waiting lists to be preserved. How it works is there are 58 counties that partner with us under the umbrella of the state program. All of the application, the ranking is done at the local board level. Just polling some of these applicant farms, they include traditional dairy operations, cash crop grain operations, intensive livestock operations, vineyards, organic farms, first-generation young farmers, century and bicentennial farms that in some cases have been in the same family since the Revolutionary War. So again, this speaks to the diversity of agriculture here in Pennsylvania. Some of the applicant farms are in suburban Montgomery County, where the development pressures are extremely intense. And by contrast, there are others in rural Bradford County. Regardless of what type of operation or where it's located, we feel strongly that all applicant farms are equally important to preserve, and we should preserve now at today's values, as property values will continue to increase in the decade ahead. In fact, the average price paid here in Pennsylvania over the past year is roughly $3,400, and that's the most it's ever been. And most of those transactions, also worth noting, are bargain sales. Farm owner generosity has been the single biggest source of leveraging for the program in the program's history. The average transaction, the farm owner accepts about 80% of that easement value. So in total, if you look at all those farms, we're talking millions and millions of dollars that Pennsylvania farm owners have donated, I should say, to the program. And so it's farm owner generosity has been our single biggest source of leveraging. So to get to to answer your question here on how the report might inform the work of the department, several desired outcomes that I would see from the report. We're hoping that it will help to influence funding decisions that are made in the decade ahead for these 1,400 additional easement purchases that we need to get to, but also look at other possible tools, for example, like tax credits or property tax relief in lieu of easement dollars that may work. And can we enhance our work with private land trust organizations to better leverage private contributions? Is there a better way of doing that? We've done such a good job of leveraging federal and state and county and local, but how do we work more with private contributions and leverage that if we want to accelerate the rate at which we're preserving farms? And also start those conversations on whether the program is meeting the needs of the next generation. You've heard of the Pennsylvania Farm Bill, that $23 million funding package for Pennsylvania, with a great emphasis on new and beginning farmers. And how can this program help to dovetail and solve those problems with land access, for example, that challenge that young farmers face? Other states have successfully implemented option to purchase at ag value easements. That would require the sale of a farm, a preserve farm, to be someone who meets the definition of a qualified beginning farmer. And how would that work in Pennsylvania? How would that look? So, again, I think the report just lends itself well to starting these discussions and looking at the program now that we're 32 years into it, moving forward.
Great, thank you, Doug. My last question for you for now is how can stakeholders help to move some of the findings forward?
Yeah, so our network is huge, I would say, at this point. We're fortunate that the first step in the process of preserving a farm starts at the township level. And Pennsylvania has a lot of townships, the Commonwealth, 2,600 municipalities, something like that. But 1,000 of them, 1,002 to be exact, have what's called an agricultural security area, or an ASA. It's a designation at the township level where a farm owner can sign up their acreage with the township in exchange for being eligible to preserve it, but it also provides protections against nuisance ordinances and lawsuits. It also provides protections against eminent domain in some cases. So, use our township base as starting that discussion too, and helping to spread that word. Also then working with county boards. As I mentioned, we have 58 counties that partner with us, and each of those counties have a volunteer board. So if you look across the state, there are roughly 400 volunteer board members that are really integrated into the farming community and their communities, and have championed this program for the past 30 years. And, that, in my opinion, has been the single biggest reason we've been so successful here in Pennsylvania, is because of that grassroots level. So use them as our boots on the ground to help spread the word on why farmland is important, preserving farmland, and engage with them on how we can move this forward in the future. But also engage with our farming community directly and our county commissioners, counties collectively. When you talk about county budgets and the difficult decisions that counties have to make, collectively, they have contributed over $500 million to the program since 1989. And that's, that really speaks to the commitment locally. So work with our county commissioners and, continue to engage with our lawmakers on why, we appreciate so much their support in giving us our dedicated funding source of cigarette tax and keeping those funds intact every year for the history of the program. So I think that we can also, use specifically like social media to capture a younger audience and help spread this, the word of the report. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us, and we see real value in this data.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug. We appreciate your very thoughtful comments and look forward to engaging the department further around ways to keep farmland in farming.
Thank you, Jamie. Chris.
All right, Chris, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Jamie, and thank you so much for joining us, Doug. I think American Farmland Trust not only recognizes the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture as one of the leaders and innovators in farmland protection, but certainly Doug is at the top in terms of his leadership and what he has given to the department and brings to the agricultural land protection community at large across the country. So we are really honored to have you joining us, Doug. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Chris.
Let's now talk about the findings from our Farms Under Threat report. So next slide, please. Today we're focusing on the State of the States, which is the second in this research series. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. Next slide. For this project, we used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land retention and protection. Next slide, please. So for those of you who did not join us for our launch events last month, I just want to touch very quickly on our national findings. From 2001 to 2016, a period of historically low housing starts, the U.S. converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. To put that in perspective, that's equal to all of the land that was planted in 2017 in the United States to fruits, nuts, and vegetables. The majority of that conversion was to low-density residential land use, a conversion that is not as visible but poses a significant threat to agriculture. And we're going to talk more about what that looks like. And lastly, more than a third of the land converted was to what we have identified was land that we have identified as nationally significant, the land best suited for intensive food and crop production into the future. So with that, and then you can see that despite the fabulous work that Pennsylvania has been doing, that Pennsylvania still shows up on the top 12 of the most threatened. And again, this is testament just to that this would likely be far worse if Pennsylvania had not put the effort that it's already put into farmland protection, but that it means that it still needs to be vigilant about continuing to do more. So let's dive in now to the data available for Pennsylvania on the interactive website. And again, we are tag teaming this with our trusty navigator, Beth Frazier, who is going to take us on this tour of the interactive website. So let me start with, to the right, Beth, if you would look and show the reports and data tab, this is where you'll find a bunch of fact sheets that describe the methodology from our Productivity, Versatility, and Resiliency Index to the types of geospatial data layers and sources that we used, and you'll see more on the scorecard as well. So there's also a tab in there. If you go to the geospatial tab, no need to do that, Beth, but I'm just pointed out that you can send us an email saying that you would like to receive some of the data layers when they are available, and we will be sending those out to stakeholders sometime, I believe, within the next month. So go ahead and sign up for those if you're interested. So let's now go to the spatial data for Pennsylvania. And to get to it, you see the state, select the state, go to Pennsylvania. And when you get there, you'll see two things, right? You see the spatial mapping and the policy scorecard. So we're going to start on the spatial mapping, and we're going to start with the land cover and use. We've used multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land in the U.S. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify nearly every type of land use in the state, including land converted. Note that one new feature of our research is that we have spatially identified woodland associated with farms. So now let's go to the Pbr Index. To understand not just the quality, but the quantity, to understand not just the quantity, but the quality of land being converted, we created a first ever assessment of agricultural land quality that specifically accounts for productivity, versatility, and resiliency. So this map shows the Pbr productivity, versatility, and resiliency ranges around the state. The index was developed in consultation with a national panel of experts. Higher Pbr values indicate higher suitability for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. Going now to nationally significant land. We used the Pbr Index to identify the best land in the country for producing crops, especially human edible food crops. This is land we now have identified as nationally significant. In Pennsylvania, you can see that 52% of agricultural land, or about 4.7 million acres, is considered nationally significant. Note that about 3.7 million acres of this is cropland, with about 500,000 acres each of pasture and woodland as well. So the last category we want to look at is conversions. As I mentioned earlier, the time period we analyzed was a short one, 2001 to 2016, and one with a deep recession in the middle. We mapped the conversion of agricultural land to two types of land use: urban and highly developed land use, or UHD, and low-density residential land use, or LDR. UHD includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion: expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas, but it also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites. So that included in this category will be oil and gas well pads and solar panel installations if they were in place before or by 2017. This project is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. So low-density residential areas range from lower-density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. All told, Pennsylvania converted almost 350,000 acres, the majority of that, 70%, to LDR. Our analysis also showed that agricultural land in LDR in 2001 was 6 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2016 than other agricultural land. So let me stop there. And Doug, if you want to offer any perspectives that you have on what you're seeing, what kind of conversion trends, where the department may have focused its efforts because of what it has already been seeing in terms of conversion. We just love your perspectives on this map and to zoom in to places if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the map certainly does tell a story. And, when we look at that, those areas of the state that are the most productive farmland are also those areas that are most at the risk of conversion to other uses. And that's something, we've known for a long time. Our funding formula for the state program is designed to, heavily fund those areas that have both the best quality soil and the most development pressure. But wow, when you look at that map and you see those conversions to low density residential over the past, several decades, it really does tell a story that we've done a good job, but there's so much more we need to be doing and can be doing. But I think, you look at the ridge and valleys throughout. There's areas around State College. There's areas in western Pennsylvania, Westmoreland County. There's areas in the northwest. So it's not just the southeast. There are just so many critical agricultural areas throughout the state that are being impacted. But it's a good tool to show visually what those impacts are.
Right. And Beth, if you would do a favor and just go back to land cover and use so people can see that the way this conversion map doesn't distinguish between the two types of conversion, so that the way, if you're looking in on the mapping, the way to do it is to go to land cover and use and then zoom in, because it will allow you then to see the areas that we have demarcated between urban and highly developed and low density residential. So you see on this map that the burnt orange is the low density residential, and the more red are the urban and highly developed areas. So we point this all out because we hope it is intended, this interactive website, to be a very useful tool to everybody in making the case and in using it for thinking about how to retain and protect agricultural land. So we are going to shift to policy now, but before we do, we want to ask you all what you see as the biggest conversion threats for Pennsylvania over the next 10 to 20 years. And we ask that now. We've seen what some of them have been, but in thinking then about what are the right policy responses, it depends in part on what the type of conversion threat is. So feel free to vote for more than one answer. If you don't see the answer that you believe is the biggest threat, write it in the question bar. And if you have any trouble voting, you might be in full screen mode, in which case you have to go out of that to vote. And so we'll give it a minute to let people vote. Okay, Beth, what do we think? Well, let me say that this is very consistent. I can't see the bottom one. I see 78% on the poorly planned. I can't see the viability. Oh, there it is at the top. But this is pretty consistent that what in the webinars that we've done so far in other states, that folks continue to believe that housing, commercial, industrial development is still going to be the primary driver, with some increased concern about energy development and obviously concern on climate change and some amount around the viability of agriculture generally. So with that, let's switch over to policy, Beth. Let me talk a little bit about it before we dive in. Our intention with the scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address the three main drivers of agricultural land conversion, to date anyway: poorly planned development, weak agricultural viability, and the fact that land is most vulnerable when it transfers between generations. While AFT has been at the forefront of federal and state policy development around farm and ranch land retention and protection since our founding, this is actually our first effort ever at a comprehensive state policy scorecard. And while I say comprehensive, we know that it is not comprehensive. There obviously states are doing a lot to help support farmers and the business of farming. Pennsylvania is an obvious leader in that. So we focused this first version of the scorecard, and there will probably be multiple versions, on 6 different types of policies and programs. These were ones that we only picked where there were at least 10 or more states with them, sort of around on the basics, and ones that had a connection to the land, but that addressed both development pressure, the issues around farm viability, and generational transfer. So you'll see these: the purchase of agricultural conservation easements. I don't need to explain. In a state like Pennsylvania, you all know, are very versed in what this does. Land use planning and growth management. What we looked at here was, is there not just support for communities and thinking around how to support communities in their work around land use planning and zoning, but also what is the connection with state government, and are states setting goals? Are they asking for consistency amongst their counties and municipalities? Those are the types of things we looked at there. Property tax relief for agricultural land, obviously very important. We know from our cost of community services studies that working lands, both farmland and forest land, do not require as much in services. They pay more in taxes than what they receive in services, and therefore it makes sense to have a different tax rate. Agricultural district programs, again, something that Pennsylvania has, not all the many states. There are 18 states that have them. We see these as a wonderful way that combines a number of different things, protections for farmers, some amount of business support, and again, some connection to farm and ranchland protection in places. And these last two, Farm Link programs and state leasing, are getting at the land access and generational transfer. We looked only at Farm Link programs that were either state authorized or there was a significant investment of state funding. We recognize that there are many Farm Link programs that are private and run by NGOs who are doing great work, but that was not the focus of our efforts. And state leasing, again, we were looking at land access and what are the opportunities for farmers to be making use of state-owned land for agriculture. And we were surprised actually at how few states actually focus on that as a way of making more land available for farming. So let's look a little bit, if you scroll down, Beth, and look at how Pennsylvania scores. Close to the top, obviously, for PACE, close to the top on property tax relief and agricultural district, and above the median for planning and land use and state leasing. And as I mentioned, Pennsylvania didn't have a Farm Link score because the report only looked at publicly supported programs. So the website allows you to dive into the factors behind the scores. So you go to the Select the Policy or Program tab, and you can see the drop-down menu. And what we're going to do right now is that we are going to drop down and look at the PACE score. So you'll see here that Pennsylvania scores 5th highest amongst all states, which is a great accomplishment. And it's especially a great accomplishment given its size relative to the other high scores, because all those other high scorers have a lot less agricultural land than Pennsylvania does. It holds the top score of average easements acquired. It scores 5th in the rate of funding per capita and 8th in the percent of farmland protected. And again, that's because it's got an awful lot more farmland to protect than many other of its neighbors. Some of the states that ranked above Pennsylvania got points for their PACE programs being authorized to purchase land in fee. We see that as something that does give programs a little bit more discretion to be able to act quickly if there is land that could be threatened, and if a state is able to work quickly with the land trust or landowner to protect it. We see that as an important small addition that is helpful in some cases. Others have scored above Pennsylvania because they monitor their easements slightly more frequently. And I know that Pennsylvania is considering, as Doug, you mentioned, the use of an option to purchase at agricultural value. That was also a component that gave some other programs additional points. Looking forward, I'm optimistic that given the changes in the 2018 Farm Bill and some administrative changes to the program made by NRCS, that Pennsylvania will be able to leverage additional federal ASEP-AL funding in the next few years. This will be especially important as Pennsylvania deals with declining state revenues right now and the difficult budget choices that seem likely in the near future. Just to point out, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, for each of these, you can see the factors that go into each of the component scores. So it gives you a better sense of how Pennsylvania scored on each of these sort of sub-components down there. Great, thank you, Beth. So let's look quickly at a couple more. Agricultural districts, a policy where Pennsylvania also scored very high. You'll see that, and this is because, as Doug mentioned, the ag security areas, you'll see that Pennsylvania does a great job in coordinating these areas with local planning and coordinating the ASAs with its permanent farmland protection efforts. It also has a higher percent of agriculture land enrolled in its program, which gives it high points. Some states scored higher because they offer additional tax incentives to farmers in these districts or areas. Some also limit public funding for certain non-farm development in districts. Let me touch on just a couple more. Turning to land use planning, Pennsylvania again did a great job in requiring counties to include a farmland preservation plan as part of their comprehensive plan, and it provides support for local planning. Where some other states do better is to require consistency between a set of state goals, either around agriculture or around compact development or both, and consistency from the county and local comprehensive plans to those state goals. So touching on just the last couple on property tax relief, Pennsylvania does well, but has a smaller percent of farmland enrolled in current use assessments than many other states. And then looking lastly at the Farm Link and state leasing programs, again, we want to recognize that there is a robust Farm Link program in Pennsylvania, but did not give any credit to it because we believe that because we were focused on state policies, and what we also are increasingly thinking is that having some amount of state authorization or state investment is a way to ensure, it's not always a way to ensure continuity. We understand that state funding comes and goes, but we feel that having some state skin in the game on Farm Link programs is a good thing in our view. So I want to talk about some things that Pennsylvania has done that are not reflected in these policies, but that we think are innovations and are very excited about. So a lot of these came in the Pennsylvania Farm Bill. So the realty transfer tax exemption, the agricultural linked investment program, and the farm vitality planning grants are all ones that clearly are ways that Pennsylvania is focused on that generational transfer question. And so we want to give Pennsylvania big kudos for having done that because those are truly exceptional. So I'm going to stop there. I hope it was a helpful cruise through the findings. Thank you, Beth, for doing that. If you do have questions, please write them in now. As we go out of the website, we're going to launch a second poll, which is, it asks which policy or policies you think it would be most valuable to focus on for Pennsylvania going forward. So let's take a minute to look at those. And I apologize because FarmLink, we could only ask 5 questions. So FarmLink is not in there if you feel that FarmLink and FarmLink from a state policy perspective should be at the top of that list. Again, please feel free to add it in there. Okay, Beth, what are we seeing? Great. Well, this again is consistent with what we have seen from folks participating in other state webinars. There's a significant interest in the policies around thinking about land use planning and how to improve that in terms of agricultural land retention and protection, followed by purchase of ag conservation easements, which is good. And I should mention now, I will talk about the National Agricultural Land Network more at the end, but the network will be hosting a series of policy webinars beginning in the early fall, which is going to be a way for us to dive into specific policy findings from around the country and how states that are doing the state leaders in land use planning, we will have them talking about why it has worked in their states. Those that have successful state PACE programs and ag districts we'll also have opportunity for those. So I hope everybody will become a member or sign up for the network and participate and learn more on those webinars. One thing missing from our spatial analysis is protected agricultural land, because there is not a comprehensive national data layer focused on agricultural land protection. We are building this new database now, and you see it here. We do have some information from Pennsylvania, but we know that there is more information coming. So what you see there for Pennsylvania is not a final version. If you are a land trust and have not heard from us and have significant amount of ag easements that you hold, please put in the question line who you are and let us know, because we will be in touch with you if you haven't already heard from us about getting that data. So let's stop, Jamie, now for some questions.
Great. Well, we've got some really great questions. Several webinar participants are interested in potentially sharing this data with their board and elected officials and members of the media. And their question is, are we able to drill down to the county level with this data?
Yes, the answer is yes. And with a caveat, on the where the caveat is, yes, it's a 10-meter resolution. I'm not a GIS person. I don't really know what that means, but I do know that, and if you go to the website, you can see the you'll see that you can go map or satellite. You can make it more transparent or not, so that you can see sort of below you what you're looking at. The low density residential is modeling. So what you will see is that this information is certainly can be used at the county level. You may see that there is active agriculture in what is labeled as low density residential. We understand that, and there's sort of two pieces behind that. We know that there are instances where there is been, a bunch of farmettes that have come in. There's certainly some farm fields that are still around new large-scale residential development, and those fields are still being farmed. The challenge there from our perspective is that it has made the management of those fields and the management of that agricultural land much more difficult, because you're having to manage around neighbors who are not always enthusiastic about odors and noise and other things. So that while there might be, while those fields might be viable for a while, they are not as viable over the longer haul as land that is, again, sort of safely in more contiguous, larger blocks. So that's the caveat in terms of looking at it, is that you may look at that low density residential and say, well, hey, I see a field. I know that's being farmed. We're not saying that it's not farmed. We're saying that it's threatened because it's been converted to this use, which then we have seen and documented that use becomes much more likely to get infilled with more highly developed land, in part because that land has become more challenged to be managed for agriculture. I hope that just answers the question.
Great. And then, Doug, if you don't mind, I may ask you this question. Do the vast, sparsely populated areas of north central Pennsylvania have agricultural potential at all?
Yeah, I certainly think they do. I think, as I mentioned, agriculture is so diverse in Pennsylvania. So whether it be the small niche type operation that you may find that's doing direct marketing right outside of Philadelphia versus, a larger, more traditional farming operation up in the northern part of the state, all that diversity adds to our ag economy. And I feel that any farm in Pennsylvania, because of where we're located, is critical to preserve, for all the reasons that I mentioned in the beginning. So, yeah, I definitely think, when we look at the rural counties and look at the program moving forward, that if there would be a way to boost funding in some of those rural areas and bring those funds into rural Pennsylvania, I think that would be a positive boost for our program and our efforts too. Because obviously we're not making any more land, whether it be in Montgomery County or Chester County or Bradford or Susquehanna or, Tioga. I think every farm we protect has value for sure.
Great. We've got a couple of more questions, but maybe we can save those for the end. We'll have a little bit of time at the end of our conversation here, wrapping up soon. And we can go to the next slide. So time is not on our side in saving our farm and ranch land, which is why AFT just announced a really bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day by 2040. Next slide. You can see here some of the ways that AFT will be strengthening its commitment to farmland protection. Here in Pennsylvania, we are hoping to leverage the National Agricultural Land Network, which Chris will talk a little bit more about shortly, to provide capacity building and peer-to-peer learning for organizations who are or want to be taking an active role in protecting farmland. We hope to partner with other land trusts that want help with some complex projects and expand the reach of our Farm Legacy Program, which keeps land and farming as it transitions to the next generation. We will be enacting farmland protection policies, enacting farmland protection policies at any level requires a broad bipartisan coalition and active community engagement. And in Pennsylvania, we want to support the outstanding work already happening in the state and help be the voice for farmland protection in Washington. And finally, we plan to use the findings from Farms Under Threat to guide our activities on the ground. And we are on the lookout for opportunities to build on this research and to learn more about what's happening to farmland on the local level. All right, next slide, please. We've provided some important spatial data layers that can be used by states, but our level of analysis really needs to be supplemented at the state level. What more could Pennsylvania do to both track its agricultural land use changes and trends, as well as potentially set the goal for retaining and protecting some percentage of remaining farmland? Pennsylvania does an outstanding job of coordinating a suite of policies around permanent protection, ag districts, and farm viability, as Chris spoke to earlier. And I think our message here is that Pennsylvania needs to keep its foot on the accelerator. It can't let up given the development pressures that's continuing, and perhaps it needs to consider ways to strengthen its land use planning to promote compact development. Again, we give Pennsylvania a lot of credit for what it's done, for the outstanding work that has happened and is currently happening. The department has truly been an innovator, really continuing to focus on tools around land access and generational transfer will be key. And AFT believes that all farmland is important and provides important co-benefits. But all farmland is not created equally, and we believe that special effort needs to be made to protect the state's most productive farmland. So we've got just a few more minutes for questions, and we have a number of really good ones. Chris, you addressed this a bit in one of your other answers, but I'm going to ask you this more directly. What is AFT's definition of low density residential, and where did we get our data for conversion from agriculture?
Great, thank you. That is an excellent question. So that is, again, modeling that we have done, and it involved looking at two different data sets. It looked at first at the county level. It came we came up with what, based on the farm size, what was a size below which we felt it was no longer truly viable for agriculture. And so we looked at farm sizes, again, using Census of Ag data. We put them into percentiles, and we basically took the lowest 10th percentile and said that below this amount of acreage, we consider this to be questionable in terms of its future viability for agriculture. We then overlaid that with U.S. Census housing block data. And unfortunately, because I have lost my internet at the moment, I can't pull up the fact sheet that explains that, and I'm not a housing block specialist. I think if you go to that reports and data tab on that website that we mentioned, there will be there is in the definition of all the terms, there's a much longer description of how we then used that housing block data. But essentially what we did was we looked at how many houses are in that housing block and overlaid again that percentile of land in farms, and putting those two together is how we came up with it.
Great. So agricultural zoning is essential for retaining farmland. Did Farms Under Threat look at the amount of agricultural zoning in Pennsylvania?
No, we did not. And I think, that again is something that would be really worthwhile to do. I suspect that some of that has been done. We, again, since this was a national report, we were not able to get down, again, because there's no comprehensive data set that allows you to easily get down to local zoning. And I guess that's the other point that I would make about that low density residential land use, is that it is perfectly possible in Pennsylvania that some of that low density residential has been done in a way, thanks to zoning, that has minimized the footprint of development and allowed for some remaining open fields. And that is terrific, because that's what you would want to have happen. So again, we don't want to say that all low density residential land use is going to automatically mean that no land is viable in that category. But what we have made is a judgment call based on what many experts have together thought would be a land acreage below which we think that the future viability of it is threatened. And let me just add one other point, again, on that low density residential. I know that some might think, wow, you don't have the protected land database in there, and does that mean that there's a lot of that low density residential land use that is actually protected? The answer, while we don't have enough data yet for Pennsylvania to know for sure, we did look at that at a number of other states where we did have that information from the protected ag land database, and we found only a 1% at most overlap of where we had found something to be low density residential that was in fact protected ag land.
Thank you, Chris. All right, I think we have time for one more, and I'll pose this to both you and Doug. Is there any national or state level discussions about putting development restrictions on soils identified as prime farmland soils? This would be a program similar to the protection in place for wetlands, and making it much more difficult to develop properties that have wetlands on them.
Thanks, Jenny. Doug, let me do this. Let me take it from a national perspective on what AFT has been thinking, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Sure.
From a national perspective, we see a variety of ways that nationally significant land that moniker should be thought about in terms of additional protections. At the federal level, for instance, we believe that let me start over. Federal agencies. We believe that federal agencies should be modeled in terms of how they fund development to encourage it to be more compact and to keep it off of agricultural land. I don't have the figures in front of me, but we know from the information that gets compiled through the Federal Farmland Protection Policy Act that there is a lot of federally funded projects that result in the conversion of productive agricultural land. So we have been talking in Congress about the importance of using nationally significant land to say, if there's going to be a federally funded project, maybe it shouldn't be on nationally significant land. There ought to be a way to get to go around that particular area or to site something elsewhere. So that is one of the things that AFT will be working on, to be trying to make that case that those ought to get, this type of farmland should get special recognition in terms of federally funded infrastructure development. The second one, whether it's federal or state, I think where we have focused some of our energy is to talk about the energy siting, and particularly, since it's much more prevalent at the moment in some places, renewable energy siting. Again, we appreciate that siting of both wind turbines and solar panels can be very helpful to a farm as a needed source of income. But what we are saying, both for that sort of on-farm and for the much broader, larger types of renewable energy infrastructure, that again, it should go to the more marginal land and not be sited on what we consider to be the nationally significant ag land. So that's sort of where AFT's focus has been at the moment. So let me now turn it over to Doug I'd love your perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. There's nothing, I would agree that would be very useful at the national level. On the state level, we haven't really had specific discussions on, having certain protections or designations on those prime farmlands. But I will say that our scoring system for our preserved farms weights very heavily on soils. So at a minimum of 40%, there's flexibilities that are built into the program that county boards can have some leveraging or wiggle room with how they score an applicant farm, but at least a minimum of 40% of that score has to be based on the best quality soils. And in fact, in order for us to even consider an easement purchase at the state level, 50% of that farm has to be in classes 1 through 4 soils. While we don't necessarily have a discussion specific to putting additional restrictions or limitations on developing those types of land, I think it's a good idea. If we could come up with something like that, but we do have that very heavily weighed in our scoring system for our PACE program.
Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I think I'll stop there and just let everyone know that unfortunately, we didn't get to all of our questions, but we're compiling a list of frequently asked questions. We will respond to your questions and make that available to you. So thank you very much. And Chris, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Great, thank you. So in the very short time we have left, let me quickly talk about 2 resources that all of you should know about. The first one has been around for a long time, and that's our Farmland Information Center. This is a clearinghouse, it's a website, it's a technical assistance answer service that AFT runs in collaboration with USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. And it is geared towards a number of audiences. It has information that is great for policymakers and academics, because it has a huge number of things focused on statistics and reports, analyzes numbers of like the Census of Agriculture. It's got a wonderful list of resources around that. it is useful in terms of looking around policies. And if somebody is working on policy development and wants to know, hey, how does the New Jersey Agricultural District Program work, you can write that in on a question or call it in, and you'll get an answer on that. So you can be looking for, we've got a searchable database of state and federal policy to look at. And lastly, it is also designed for agricultural landowners, so that I know Pennsylvania has a wealth of land trusts and county and township programs, but if there is somebody who wants to direct a farmer or farmland owner to look up information, we have a bunch of new information up there around the Federal Ag Conservation Easement Program. It's worth just going in to look around and see what's on the website, because it's all very useful. The National Agricultural Land Network is new. We have just launched it. It is essentially formalizing what AFD has provided ever since 1980, which is to do some amount of peer networking, information sharing amongst those who are actively engaged in agricultural land protection or planning. We are looking to expand the network, so members can be any entity, whether it's a land trust, whether it is a township, whether it's a county, or the state agency, are all welcome to become members of it. It is an educational and information sharing. We are looking to step up our programming, and in fact, that reminds me that we're going to go out with the very last poll that's going to help us figure out. In fact, Beth, maybe you can launch that poll right now. We're looking to figure out what programming would be the most helpful to folks in this space. And I recognize that in Pennsylvania particularly, you have a lot of good peer networking that happens already. So we're not looking to reinvent the wheel, but where we can be helpful and provide conversations that are targeted to a particular either challenge or some discussion of a federal policy, say, those are the types of things that we are looking to do. So again, you can feel free to choose more than one here, but if there are particular things that you feel would be most helpful about the network, we're going to try to address those. So that farmland.org/NALN will take you to a place where you can say that you want to be a member or a collaborator, and I hope that everybody will make use of that. So let's just see those findings there. And Jamie, I'll turn it back to you. Let me just say again, thank you. And I forgot to say that in the network, we are thrilled that Doug has agreed to be on our steering committee, so Pennsylvania will be well represented. And we really look forward to stepping up some programming in ways that will be valuable to Pennsylvania practitioners. And that's great to see on the land use planning tools. Tells me what we got to do next. So let me turn it back to you, Jamie, for the last final word.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. And Doug, thank you for being with us today. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me or any member of the American Farmland Trust team. Thank you again, and have a great day.